Hello, good morning. Welcome to the Wilson Center, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I've been here for 3 years. I finally get all the words right. My name is Laura Dawson. I'm the director of the Canada Institute. I am delighted to see you all here. We have a great panel, and we have a great audience, so I can't imagine how we could have done better. Thanks especially for getting here through the snow. We have a terrific conversation today. I confess I did almost nothing except show up and I put some lipstick on. All of the heavy lifting has been done by our terrific State Department fellows, Lynn Platt and Robin Quinville, who is where? This is such a great deal. We make out like bandits here. We get senior officials with experience and wisdom and expertise. Plus, they bring their own salary and benefits, and we get to claim their labor. I think in the old days, they used to call it, I don't know, indentured servitude. Now we call it the State Department Fellowship. So off the top, let me thank Robin and Lynn for their great vision and hard work in putting this together. In keeping with the I was going to say exploit, but that's just not the right word. How we benefit from State Department expertise. Our moderator and host for today is Career Ambassador Tony Wayne, who has been a global fellow with the Mexico Institute and with the Wilson Center for 2 years now, Tony? Year and a half? Mm-hmm. So we are delighted to have him offering his expertise and insights here today. You're going to hear from me a bit later when I'm going to put on my pseudo-expert hat, talking a little bit about NAFTA. But just let me reiterate our thanks to you, thanks to the scholars, government representatives, and especially all of our sponsors and donors who are in the room. Without your generous contributions, none of this would be possible. Phone lines are open now. This is like the PBS pledge drive. That's it for me. I'd like to turn the program over to Ambassador Tony Wayne.
Thank you very much, Laura. And as Laura is the head of the Canada Institute, I'm associated also with the Mexico Institute. And it's one of the unique things about the Wilson Center is we actually have two institutes focused on North America, Canada and Mexico. We have a great group of people here. We have Sean Donnan, right next to me, who is the World Trade Editor for the Financial Times and covers the whole range of those international economic issues from Washington. He's been with the FT since the early 2000s and covered a whole bunch of different areas. And as an editor in London before he got here, covered everything in the world, probably, in one way or another. Next to Sean is Daniel Andrich. Daniel is the president and CEO of the Office of the Representative of German Industry and Trade, and prior to that worked for the Federation of German Industries, the BDI, in Berlin. And he's going to give the perspective from German industry on these questions. Next to Daniel is Damien Levy. Damien is at the EU mission here in Washington as their first counselor for trade, agriculture, and has a lot of good experience at the commission, but in recent years working on trade issues with the trade commissioner and then in the trade directorate at the EC. And then Michelle Egan, who spent some time here year before last at the Wilson Center, but is a long-time specialist and knows extremely well Europe and has been doing a lot of thinking about that for many years, and recently on Brexit also. And so we're happy to have her here. As we explore this topic about the relationship between NAFTA and Europe, let me just start off by sharing a couple of, more than a couple, but some facts to show the importance in both directions of these two relationships. So NAFTA has a trade of about $1.2 to $1.3 trillion a year. That's $3.3 billion a day. That's more trade for the U.S. than the U.S. has with all of the EU together in a trade perspective. Supports about 14 million jobs in the United States. Total investment between the three partners is about $730 billion. Now, if we switch to the transatlantic relationship, that total trade's about $3 billion a day, so about 300 million less than transatlantic trade. But it's still about 1/3 of global trade and about 40% of services trade in the world. What really makes this relationship different, however, in a transatlantic sense, is the very intense relationship in foreign direct investment, portfolio investment, affiliate sales, meaning subsidiaries of companies from the other side of the Atlantic selling things on the other side of the Atlantic than the parent company. And then also technology flows and digitally enhanced services, which are pretty unique across the Atlantic. And then when we look at the investment side, it really jumps out. Total value of European investments in the U.S. in 2015 was about $8.4 trillion. The total investment stock was $2.2 trillion in 2015. Nearly 3/4 of foreign direct investment coming into the United States in 2016 was from Europe, and about 70% of the FDI in Europe was from U.S. firms in that same year. So what this means is the relationship is probably more important in its investment-related context than in its trade context, even though we usually focus mostly on trade. And so just one example of that, sales by those companies whose parent is on the other side of the Atlantic, totaled $5.5 trillion in 2015. That's sales domestically in either Europe or the United States, or exports. A lot of them are exports too. So again, it's a whole different way of looking at a relationship. And so what we're going to examine today and ask each of our speakers to share their thoughts on, so what's the impact of what happens in NAFTA in all of this? And I've specifically asked them to think a little bit about, well, what if the U.S. pulls out of NAFTA? What will happen? And what if NAFTA negotiations go forward? What would they like to see in the outcome of those negotiations, and what would they like to avoid seeing in those negotiations? So let me start off asking Sean to make some comments.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. This is my first time at the Wilson Center, and I feel humbled, not just by the venue, but also by the folks I've got here on the panel with me. So thank you, Ambassador, and thank you, Laura, and the rest of you at the Wilson Center for organizing this. I thought I'd start off with a lunch I had with Martin Wolf, who's our chief economics commentator, back when I took this job in 2013. I had just come off the World News Desk, where I'd been running our international economic and political coverage, and we'd just gone through the global financial crisis in 2008, the Eurozone crisis starting in 2010, the Arab Spring. I had correspondents racing around the Middle East. We were watching the kind of world unwind and rewind and change in all sorts of ways. And I had already agreed to take this job to cover trade. And Martin said we should have lunch. And we had lunch, and he said, "You've made a terrible mistake. There's absolutely nothing going on in the world of trade. There is everything that was going to happen or is going to happen in the world of trade stopped happening with the Uruguay round in the mid-1990s. The Doha round's going nowhere. This TTIP thing, this transatlantic thing that they've just launched, that's nonsense. That's not going to go anywhere. This trans-Pacific partnership out in the Pacific, that's absolute nonsense. That's just a flight of fancy. That won't go anywhere." And I said, "Oh, geez." And I went home to my wife and said, "I think I've made a terrible mistake." And of course, I woke up the next morning and said, no, Martin Wolf has to be wrong. There's got to be a point someday when he is wrong. And you can go back through history and find examples, I won't bring them up, where Martin has been wrong in the past, and this was one of them. And I'm happy that he was wrong, because really we're at this astonishing moment in trade and geopolitics, and NAFTA is this kind kind of small part of it. And that's where really I think the European interest and the relevance to European investors come in. I kind of wake up every day and I feel, I look at my phone, I look at the president's Twitter feed, some question marks kind of come into my head, and then I remember that we are at this astonishing moment in history, not just because of the man we have in the White House, but also because of what's happening in the world of geopolitics. And that is, and his impact on that. And so daily we are trying to answer this question, it feels like at the FT. Are we watching an America that, like my colleague Ed Luce has argued for a number of years, is in inevitable decline and faced with rising powers across the Pacific? Are we watching a temporary blip in history? And these are, of course, are questions that we're not going to be able to answer for some time. Come back to me in 20, 30 years, and we'll have a better idea. But it's fun to watch along the way. And NAFTA really is, I think of as, sort of, if you rewind a little bit and I think about the previous administration and their plan for trade, it all pivoted around NAFTA. NAFTA was, the Obama administration wanted it to be the economic core of a alternative set of economic relationships to a rising China. And if you think about it in terms of if you sat down with some members of the administration, they would think, they would kind of project forward and say, think of the day when we have the Trans-Pacific Partnership out towards Japan and the Pacific, and it's expanding, and we're getting the South Koreas of the world to join it. And remember that this is our attempt at renegotiating NAFTA. We're delivering on that promise, but NAFTA is the core of that. Then flip across the Atlantic and look at the transatlantic trade and investment partnership, TTIP, and think of that as the other piece. And pretty soon you've got, half, 2/3 of the global economy tied into alliances that are built around and that kind of pivot around North America. And what we have done there is we have reinforced America's place in the 21st century and in the world. And of course, then November 8th last year happens. The TPP is ripped up within a couple of months, or at least the U.S. withdraws from it. It probably will still go ahead with some other countries. TTIP is put, in the words of Cecilia Malmström, the EU's commissioner, the deep freeze. I think that's right, Danielle. And it's not dead, but it's way down in the basement. I'd argue it's at the bottom of the deep freeze, but in that kind of netherworld of hot dogs from a few years ago. And you have a president who has threatened to withdraw from NAFTA and is actively seeking to renegotiate that relationship and challenging the primacy of that relationship in America, as a kind of building block, the main building block for its economic relationships around the world. That's how we entered 2017 with that grand story, and we've been watching with a mixture of awe and some days, if you go back to April and you talk to some of the people in the business community and the Canadian and Mexican embassies at the time, that kind of Black Wednesday period where they were racing to kind of save NAFTA, where the president came very close to signing an executive order to trigger withdrawal. We've been through the October dropping of the poison pills, and what to me is an astonishing reaction from the Chamber of Commerce and other business groups. There was a moment there in October, November of last year where if you walked into the Chamber of Commerce just across from the White House, it felt like guerrilla headquarters. Tom Donahue was almost putting on Che Guevara hats in terms of his resistance to the administration. You really had never. We laugh, but it was an astonishing moment where you really had never seen the U.S. business community so uniformly lined up against an American administration when it came to a trade deal, and that was and that's something that's persisted. I think something's flipped since then a little bit. I think I would argue the consensus view now, and you hear it from some of those business groups, is that imminent threat of withdrawal, despite what we saw Reuters report last week, and not necessarily because I don't think they were reporting something that wasn't said to them. I do think some Canadian officials kind of went off the reservation a little bit and said to them they thought an imminent withdrawal was imminent. And we've seen it in the president's speech to the American Farm Bureau last week, and also his interview with the Wall Street Journal, where he seems to be signaling a timeline for negotiations that goes through the Mexican elections, which I think is really, really interesting, and takes us into the fall. So I think, that's kind of where we are in terms of the negotiations. I would just make one more point before I hand off, and that's to get back to this idea of geopolitics and the place of Europe in all of this. Tom Vilsack, the former agriculture secretary, said something to me, and he said it to a few other folks since, but last summer, where he talked about NAFTA, the importance of NAFTA, not just as he's now at the Dairy Council. He represents the cheese and milk on behalf of the U.S. And he talked about not just the kind of the offensive interest that dairy has in Canada in terms of addressing the barriers to trade there, but also in terms of a broader, what he called almost a standards war in the world. And that is, of course, he has in mind geographic indicators, the French insistence that only camembert can only come from, I don't know where, Damien, but
Normandy.
Normandy. There we go. It certainly cannot come from Vermont. That Parma ham can only come from Parma, and so on. And we can Manchego cheese, feta cheese, etc., and so on. Now that's cheese is always fun and to talk about, but that's part of a bigger battle which gets into auto safety standards. It gets into chemical standards. It gets to GM crops and so on. And that. Tom Vilsack's argument was that with by reopening NAFTA and kind of ceding the positive negotiating agenda to the EU, you were going to lose ground in this kind of standards war around the world. At the very time when, if you think back to the original idea of TTIP, a big part of that was in kind of unifying standards, solidifying transatlantic standards as a kind of big transatlantic holding of hands against China and its role in standards in the world. So it's a bit of a ramble, but I think that's how we think about NAFTA and our interest in NAFTA. I haven't gotten into what we hope to see in the negotiations because we're just neutral observers in this, of course. But I think that's where I'd like to start.
Okay, thanks, Sean. Just before I go to Daniel, just to add on the Mexican elections, if we don't do the agreement now, it's at least a year and probably a year and a half away, because you're going to have the new president doesn't come in until December 1st, and if it's a new president with little previous government experience, as the one currently leading the polls, it will be at least 6 months before they're ready to get back into it.
That gets into a little bit. Sorry, I don't want to get up here, but that gets into one of my favorite theories now, which is that we should be preparing for zombie NAFTA, and that's a NAFTA that refuses to die but doesn't quite live.
Laura's written about that quite a bit, so she can add to it. It's in the cybernetic freeze. That's right, Danielle.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ambassador Wayne, and thank you, Laura, for the invitation. Robin, for bringing us together. Thank you very much. I'm honored and delighted to be here and be part of this panel. As you said, I'm the representative of German Industry and Trade. We're basically representing the business community interests, German business community interests here in Washington, D.C., but also our mission is to foster transatlantic economic integration. So that's why we are not only focusing on directly bilateral trade and investment relationship between Germany and the U.S., but also the fact that transatlantic economic relationship is impacted by external factors. And currently, particularly 3 factors, I would say, from the North American perspective that would most critical would be NAFTA. From the European regional perspective, probably Brexit. This is a huge impact, external factor. And from a global perspective, that would be the challenge how we do transatlantic deal with China. What is our perspective on China in the US, and what is the perspective in Germany and European perspective? So this is going to be the global perspective. But since we're talking about NAFTA today, I'd like to make a couple of points. First point is why it is important for German businesses in the US, Mexico, and Canada is we have 5,800 German companies in the NAFTA region. German companies have invested, and it's all about investment, as you said, Ambassador, about 314 billion euros in the NAFTA countries, 290 US, 15 around in Canada, 10 approximately in Mexico, 10 billion euros. So that's a heavy, they're heavily invested in the NAFTA region. But it's not only about investment for us, it's also a lot about trade, and the German NAFTA trade in 2016 was 194.5 billion euros. German-US trade was 164, German-Canada 13.5, and German-Mexico was 16 billion euros. So that's why it is very important for German businesses what's going on in the NAFTA region and where we are going with the NAFTA renegotiations. Why are German companies invested and do trade in the NAFTA region? Mainly for me because of 2 reasons. First of all, it is an absolute crucial, important, and very attractive market. You have 28% of the world's GDP, you have 7% of its population. Especially, Germany is a lot about car industry, not only about OEMs. Everybody knows BMW, VW, and so forth. But we have a lot of suppliers, big suppliers like Bosch, Continental, all these companies. So we look very closely in German industry and Germany as a whole, German economy on the car industry. And Mexico has, and correct me if I'm wrong, at least 40 FTAs. So this secures access to half of the global car market for German businesses. US has 20 FTAs, which has access to 10% of the global car market. Measured by value, the US is the #1 export market, not only for German cars, but for German products. Still, it was 2015, I think, biggest trade relations. Now it's still the biggest export market for German companies. And German car makers have quadrupled their total US production since 2009. So this tells you something about the importance of the US and of NAFTA as an investment region. Second reason is NAFTA is an integrated platform for global export. Almost, and correct me if I'm wrong, like the sense of the EU, right? I mean, it's about an integrated market. For German companies, this means that more than half of German cars made in the US are exported abroad. 41% of German cars made in the US are sold in the US, and the remaining 6% go to Canada and Mexico. You probably all know BMW in Spartanburg, South Carolina is the largest exporter in the US. We have also, with reference to the supply chains, 2/3 of all German exports from Mexico go to the US and Canada. VW produces around 450,000 vehicles in the state of Puebla, 87,000 in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And Audi, as part of the VW group, so to say, produces 150,000 cars in Puebla. BMW is not only invested in Spartanburg, but is investing more than $2 billion to build a plant in San Luis Potosi in Mexico, with a production capacity of 150,000, most intended for global export. And also, so I don't get in any trouble, Daimler builds trucks in 4 different plants throughout Mexico, but has 11 production facilities in the US, 1 car, 1 van, and 9 I think trucks and buses. They produce over 300,000 cars in the United States of America. So this is the German car perspective, but also in general, industries and firms, not only German ones, are integrated. 20% of all US-Mexico trade is intra-firm trade. 53% of US-Mexico trade is intra-industry trade. By the way, 63% is US-Canada trade, is intra-industry trade too. So 75% of US-made car parts go to Mexico and Canada. So for every dollar a Mexican car or car part exports, there's already 40 cents of US input in it. Just to add on this, because we're very focused on the automotive sector, it's also, from a German business perspective, also about chemicals and machinery. These two branches look very closely at the NAFTA renegotiations too. Just wanted to add on this. Ambassador asked me yesterday in preparation and run-up to this meeting about a red and green list on the NAFTA renegotiation, so to say which changes I would be in favor, or the German business community would be in favor, and the negative changes might occur out of the negotiations. So to stay in this picture, I would say my red list is pretty red. It is like a fire truck with its lights and sirens on, and the green list looks a little bit brighter, more like a mini Christmas tree to me when I'm looking at the negotiations. Modernization of this agreement is good. I mean, most of us can agree on that, I would say. That's why also the EU also modernizes its engagement there. But do no harm is absolutely critical for German businesses, especially in the automotive sector. Meaning, German business community is open about, the companies who are invested in this market, about modernizing, especially in the field of digital trade, IP, the energy sector, especially in Mexico, and customs facilitation. I think these are more or less also the parts where the EU is engaged in. But the danger of a less liberal outcome from the renegotiation is absolutely problematic for German business community, as it is for the US Chamber. We're in close contact with Tom Donahue and others at the Chamber on this. Like raising the local content requirement for cars from 62.5% to 85% with 50% local content, US local content, would be absolutely problematic, I think, for the outcome of this renegotiations, or everything like sunset clauses after 5 years, or dollar-for-dollar procurements. We're concerned about these things. German businesses want to be invested in NAFTA, want to be invested in the US, want to do trade within the NAFTA region, but they need absolutely reliability and predictability for their investments. I've been invited here on the panel. It's about European investors. So this was the German investors' perspective I can give you on that. Reliability and predictability is absolutely crucial for an engagement and for planning purposes for investments. So let me just finish with one last comment. We're not only focusing from our business representative perspective here in Washington, but we also look at the NAFTA renegotiation as an indicator of how the administration looks at trade and how they might negotiate or renegotiate trade agreements in the future. So, and we see a strong and passionate focus on reducing trade deficits, bringing jobs back, and trade enforcement too. Especially the discussion about reducing trade deficits. I don't want to open this discussion again. We've been talking about this last year a lot, the economic sense of trade imbalances and how important it is for bringing back jobs and economic growth and so forth. But I do understand that the administration sort of has a mission statement on that to reduce and to be very honest, it's a massive trade deficit with $724 billion, I think, last year in goods with the world. So I do understand that. What we try to encourage the administration is, please focus on spurring exports and not restricting imports. I think this is crucial for German businesses in the United States of America. They want to export out of the US, but they do need imports to export to components, as we call in German, the beautiful German word Vorleistungsprodukt, meaning you need components. I highly doubt that you can build a car or anything else 100% only in one country. So that's why we have some doubts if you withdraw from NAFTA or implement the suggestions I made about rules of origin at 85% or local content 50%, that this automatically attracts investments in the US or bring back jobs to the US. I don't know. I mean, we live in a globalized world with integrated value chains. Would companies move automatically back from, I don't know, Mexico to the US, or would they go elsewhere? I would not be so sure about this.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Damien, por favor.
Thank you very
S'il vous plaît.
Thank you very much. Don't know whether you've seen the movie Murder on the Orient Express recently. Agatha Christie, based on the novel Agatha Christie. Remind me that when I have to explain my French-speaking accent, I can say I'm Belgian, I'm not French. Like Hercule Poirot. When I arrived here about 3.5 years ago, maybe more the same time as Sean, I arrived here as Deputy Chief Negotiator. I had been Deputy Chief Negotiator for TTIP and head of the unit Canada and TTIP, so also I played a role on CETA, which in the meantime we concluded. And when I arrived, as trade negotiators always optimistic and ambitious, I thought, well, maybe in 4 or 5 years we can conclude TTIP and get it ratified. And then came the 8th or 9th of November. So we are where we are. But during the previous administration, we supported TPP. We said it's good the United States is negotiating TPP. It's raising the standards. It's dealing with a number of issues we haven't been able to deal with in the WTO, and also it helped us, or in parallel we negotiated our own agreements with Vietnam and with Japan. Vietnam is concluded, hopefully will be ratified this year. Japan, you've seen in various steps, but also I think later this year or early next year we are going to see an entry into force of our agreement with Japan, and we've pulled out the Singapore agreement out of the Court of Justice in a way. And so I think this year you will see 2 or 3 trade agreements entering into force with TPP partners, basically. So that was our position at the time. You're also aware that we are negotiating an update of our Mexico FTA. That's a decision that was taken before November of last year, actually quite some time before. So the upgrade of our Mexico FTA hopefully will deliver soon. Negotiations are not easy. At the time we had let a lot of agricultural issues outside of the FTA, including government procurement. Now we're trying to put them into the new agreement. So that's a challenge. But we're very hopeful that this will happen. And obviously there is a link between the NAFTA 2.0 negotiations and our agreement, because we see obviously Mexico trying to do the same in the 2 negotiations. It's one of the classical things in a negotiation that you say, oh, I want the same treatment that you gave to that country. And so obviously Mexico is careful in the concessions they want to make to us or to the US and Canada in the parallel negotiations to make sure it anticipates the consequences of its decisions in a way. I thought I would briefly give you some data points on the importance of the EU in North America. As Tom said, it's largely an investment relationship. We are by far the #1 holder of stock of investment, not only the source in any year of the last 10 years, but by far the largest holder of FDI. And I think most of these companies, like Daniel said, for German business, came here because it's a very big market and it's a platform for exports, but it's an integrated market. And any change to that agreement or a termination of the agreement obviously have a very important impact on investment decisions taken in all kinds of sectors in North America. If you just look at trading goods, which is kind of an easy metric for us, for Mexico, we are the number 2 destination of export and the number 3 source of imports after the US and China. So Mexico exports significantly more to the EU than to Canada. If I take Canada, we are the number 2 export destination. Canada exports 10 times more to the United States compared to the EU, and then it's China. So Mexico is further down the list. We are the number 3 source of imports after the US and China, sorry. So that means that we are a very important trading partner with any of the 3 in North America. Now, looking at NAFTA 2.0 negotiations, I must say, on the one hand, listening to President Trump when he was campaigning, there's a logic to renegotiating NAFTA. If the trade deficit metric is one of the criteria to guide where you negotiate or renegotiate agreements, makes sense to focus on NAFTA. From a different perspective, you wonder, is that the priority for this country? But that's, the political decision, and we are ourselves negotiating an upgrade of our Mexico agreement, so we perfectly understand you need to modernize an old agreement, and we just had our new agreement with the Canadians. We're negotiating an agreement with the United States, TTIP. So from that perspective, it makes sense. And historically, you need to remember that when NAFTA was concluded, that provoked shockwaves in the world of trade policy, and that kind of accelerated the conclusion of the Uruguay round. That people said, oh, now they have this, so we need to actually react and conclude the Uruguay round. So NAFTA historically played a very important role, and a new NAFTA agreement may actually play an important role as well. Can't compare, of course. Looking at the content of the agreement, I think we would welcome new rules in e-commerce, in IP, in state-owned enterprises, subsidies, energy, obviously. The way we've been working, and the old NAFTA agreement was like that as well, is, you agree in a number of free trade agreements, new disciplines, and then you try to have those disciplines agreed at either in a plurilateral or at world level. So I think it's always a stepping stone. So any stepping stone that goes in the right direction would be welcome. On market access, we always welcome a further realization. We are curious, I wouldn't use red list or whatever, but we're just curious on rules of origin, in particular as regards the impact on European investors here in North America. Curious to see how they manage the 5-year sunset or review clause. Obviously, we think when you negotiate a trade agreement, you set up an improved framework for investors, for traders, for farmers, for SMEs, and you don't want to have a contract which is renewable every 5 years. Curious on ISDS, what we think is the way to go on ISDS. We have the investment court system where we modernized the standards, so the rights and obligations, if you want, of states, and we completely modernized the dispute resolution mechanism. And maybe to finish, we also wonder whether a new NAFTA agreement will be showing the way for the new US trade policy, or whether the art of the deal means that you negotiate each agreement on its merits, and what you do in one agreement has no consequences for what you do in another agreement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very helpful. Michelle.
Thank you. Some great commentary here. I will start off by saying we think about this as globalization, value chains and supply chains and so forth. My first car as a teenager in Britain was called a Vauxhall, and I had no idea at the time that this was an American company. So it's a long debate. The first comment that I would make in terms of this is that when we're talking about the changes in NAFTA, obviously for the auto sector, the rules of origin issue and local content are particularly important. But one of the things to realize, given the statistics we've heard, is many European firms are highly vested. They have sunk costs. And so to make changes is going to be very costly. And we should also acknowledge, I think, that the United States has also provided, European companies have also been the beneficiary of tax breaks, concessions, and other support payments within NAFTA countries, not just the US, but also in Mexico. So, there has been a positive synergy. And so the prospects in terms of NAFTA, I just wanted to make a few comments. We should talk about as well, the opinions are very divided amongst trade lawyers about whether the president has the constitutional authority to withdraw from any concluded agreement, or whether the president must seek congressional authorization. And so many contemporary trade agreements do include a withdrawal clause, but I think, the prospect of withdrawing also raises the prospect of retaliation from aggrieved trade parties. And so that should also be part of the discussion. And we hear a lot about, comparisons of trade agreements, and NAFTA being such an important one for the United States. But comparing it to Europe is also very, very difficult, because NAFTA was the US template, but Europe has a lot of different kinds of trade agreements depending on the partner. It could be a customs union, it could be a free trade agreement, it could be a generalized system of preferences. So the European template of trade agreements is much different than perhaps we think about in terms of the NAFTA template. But when we talk about NAFTA, what's different as well in terms of perhaps the TTIP negotiations is that we've heard a lot about a sunset clause and about a termination after 5 years and so forth that's on the table from the US. And I think about the contrast of that with the TTIP ambitions. The TTIP was designed to be a living document. It was meant to be for the prospect for revisions and updates, whereas you have a sunset clause is a much very different discourse and a starting point in terms of aspirations and outcomes. And so if I was going to say, yes, NAFTA does need modernization and updating, because obviously a lot of people have said, look at what's happened. We had a first set of trade agreements, oftentimes focused on tariffs, and now we've got a second generation of trade agreements. Now they're focused on things like e-commerce, inclusion of services. Oftentimes the side agreements that were on there for sort of labor or the environment, if you look at CETA, they're now included in the actual text. So that's different. And I also want to bring in the fact that we tend to focus very much on the federal level when, if you look at what is disliked in the United States, investor-state dispute settlement and investor-state dispute provisions are very unpopular at the state and local level, as they allow the investors to sue a host government, often for sort of spurious investment concerns, and that might lead to potential revisions. So if I was going to sort of put on there what I'd like to see in a NAFTA, my green box, the better options, NAFTA, could be better, it could be improved, it could be updated. And as with most of these second generation trade agreements, there's a lot of focus in the initial documents from USTR about regulatory cooperation, regulatory alignment. And I feel like I'm in a time warp here. Every trade agreement I hear about talks about regulatory cooperation and regulatory alignment. And it's plagued transatlantic relations for probably 2 decades. Call it differences in standards, call it differences in regulations. And I think that it's a great aspiration. It's incredibly difficult in practice. And there are so many options out there in terms of how do you deal with regulatory differences. And one, the Europeans would talk about regulatory forums, mutual recognition agreements, regulatory equivalency, good manufacturing practice. There's an array of options on the table. And of course, what's interesting for me is you have the Regulatory Cooperation Council already in place between Canada and the United States. My question is why is it not trilateral? Because you have a NAFTA market. So that would be my first suggestion. My second one is that a lot of the issues are not dissimilar to what Europe wants in its trade negotiations. It doesn't want restrictions on data localization. It doesn't want prohibitions on custom duties on electronic transmissions, and probably to deal with issues of customs facilitation administration, build on changes in digital technology, expedite the process of moving goods and services across borders. If anything, as I focus on Brexit, I'm also interested in how, models such as the Canadian-US border might matter for Brexit, particularly in the Irish border. So I feel like everybody else that the worst issue is the preoccupation with the deficit reduction as a specific objective for the NAFTA negotiations. What I have concerns about are two issues, and Damien really put it nicely about the contiguous or ongoing negotiations. You have CETA, you have EU-Mexico, and how does that square with the NAFTA updates? And I think that the investment arbitration in its different chapters are worth looking at. And obviously, CETA now has a new model with an investor treaty arbitration and the court. The problem is pushing that model in NAFTA in the current climate is very difficult, given the fact that the United States has really got a problem with the judicial branch of the WTO. I think it's going to be a very, very hard sell. So the one thing I would say, it's sort of ironic, is that we do need more policy coherence in the trade and investment interface field. They've often been discussed in sort of isolation in silos, and it doesn't respond to sort of cross-border production networks. The irony of this is that now the EU finally has investment in Lisbon. It's become so contentious that I'm sort of saying that perhaps you might end up separating it again. Mm-hmm. And so, the things we'd like may not necessarily be problems in NAFTA. They may also be problems for the EU as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Just to add on the regulatory part, I can verify, having worked for about 10 years or so in US-EU economic issues, that the regulatory is really hard to do. And there is a US-Mexico Council on regulatory cooperation. It's just never functioned very well. Also because, for a lot of reasons, which I'd be happy to talk to you about, but not a trilateral one. Laura, please.
Okay, good morning. Again, I'm thinking about fish. I think when you talk about trade, you have to talk about fish. Aquaculture is a very important part of trade, and I think it's probably protected in Canada because we protect all kinds of culture, including agriculture, viticulture, silviculture, etc. So let's think about things that float, whales perhaps, big fish and small fish. It's not particularly inspired, but it's worth repeating that the history of trade regulatory, trade agreements, trade blocks is a pendulum between convergence and divergence, that at particular times in our history we have felt the need to converge, in particular the end of World War II. How can we get people to play nice and get along economically? And we have seen this repeated at various other times in our political economic history. So in this period of convergence, we see large trading blocks that are encouraged towards rules convergence. We've heard from all of the speakers about rules convergence and regulatory convergence. Why? Because it's cheaper to do business when your rules line up between borders. I used to say naively, as a trade policy professor, those many years ago, that trade is not about politics, it's about bringing a willing buyer closer to a willing seller. Boy, was I wrong. But in those periods of convergence, we have these whales sort of, growing and accumulating, and they're encouraged by their globally competitive firms, the GEs of the world, let's say. And then we have these periods of divergence or division. And this is about when it's timed or politicians feel it's necessary to protect potentially non-competitive domestic industries, keep those bad guys out, put up big tariff walls. And this protectionism is supported by government policy. So the long wave theory of trade development is that we sort of swing between these periods of divergence and convergence. I would say, given what we've heard this morning, the United States and the United States policy as it is articulated through North America is one of these whales. Another one of these whales, of course, is the European Union. Now, in my flaky version of history, I don't see these two whales as necessarily competitive. Who do big fish want to trade with? Other big fish. Little markets like Canada are not particularly interesting. They're fun, but they're not where your real economic return is going to lie. So I don't see our big whales in the trading system necessarily opposed to each other, but bringing whales together, may I say mating whales, is not easy, and it requires a fair, just the right conditions. Canada, on the other hand, little fish, little fish. Now, I used to go out and talk about economic development prospects, talking to countries like Costa Rica, and I'd say, it's okay if you're not a big fish. If you're a nimble fish and you can swim faster, you can be competitive and make great global gains. But sometimes you need to be a big fish. Canada, as a market of 35-ish million people, is a very skilled trading nation. Great negotiators, right, Carrie? Who do really, really good work on behalf of their constituents. But it's a challenge when you are such a small market to be in a negotiation with the whales. And so talking about the Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement, the CETA, Canada and the EU negotiated a pretty good deal. It was really the first agreement that Canada has done in a while, and possibly the EU, between advanced industrialized economies. So we get a chance to talk about advanced treatment of IT and intellectual property and biotech products, et cetera. It wasn't one of those conversations where you have to talk about special and differential treatment, less developed, et cetera, et cetera. It was a chance to sort of trot out the new concepts and see how they work. So it was a really good deal in that sense. Some great gains for both Canadians and Europeans in areas of agri-food, developments in government procurement, a much more streamlined area for labor mobility, able to come to accommodation on certain rules in pharmaceuticals. But as I said, it's an incomplete agreement. It's riddled with little Post-it notes. I'm sure there's not actually Post-it notes in there, Damien, but I'm imagining it as here's how the agreement between Canada and EU works on automotive rules of origin. But as everybody knows, there are no strictly Canadian cars. There are Canadian, American, Mexican composite vehicles. So here's the Post-it note for treatment today. Here's what we'll do when we finally get the Americans into this. Similarly, Damien, I'm going to blame you in particular, or credit you in particular for taking a hard line with Canada on geographic indications in agricultural sector. Good for you. You got the Roquefort, and I think you got the feta, and you got 4 or 5 other things. My friends at USTR say they're shocked and appalled that Canada did not hold the line on this. Really, Canada, did the best that it could under the circumstances, saying, we are a NAFTA country. Our fundamental economic interests are with the United States. We cannot give up the ship, another aquatic analogy, just because Damien and his colleagues are so nice and so convincing. So this is an incomplete agreement. It's got little Post-it notes everywhere, and it was negotiated with the intention that eventually the U.S. would be on board, that TTIP would be on board, that we'd have some sort of, if not full convergence of North America and EU, at least a closer alignment, whales swimming in similar challenges, similar channels. That hasn't happened, and so Canada continues to be the nimble fish trying to swim between the NAFTA and EU markets and trying to negotiate this new NAFTA. we've heard a lot about the what does Christopher Freeland call them? The unconventional issues, the hot button issues, the red line issues. These other folks have covered them very well. But we don't hear enough about the competitiveness gains that are being negotiated in the deal. I think Canada and Mexico are going to stay at the table as long as possible, and the U.S. negotiators as well, to focus on these areas of productive 21st century type economics. And the areas that we're making, I think, very good progress on include border trade facilitation. You know, the NAFTA, 1994, we did customs declarations with paper and pen and carbon paper, using a few information technology tools, using some new mechanisms to get stuff across the border better and faster is a gain for everybody, and we're doing a pretty good job there. Regulatory alignment. We understand, as Tony says, there's going to be a chapter, we hope, on regulatory good practice, which takes the Canada-U.S. Regulatory Cooperation Council elements and the U.S.-Mexico elements, and I think moves towards a trilateral alignment where possible, trilateral conversations everywhere else. And that's a great start. Agriculture, not dairy, necessarily, not the greatest hits areas where we all defend, but in our export-oriented agriculture, in areas where we get along pretty well, in fruits and vegetables because we have integrated supply chains, in oil seeds, and even in meat, where we've tended to bash each other over the head in the past, we're getting along pretty well and making some good gains in agriculture. More importantly, we're updating those standards and technical barriers that, again, haven't really been too evolved since 1994. Origin, we're not getting along particularly well on brute rule levels of origin for the auto sector, but modernizing our approach to how you do origin tracing and traceability, that is a very important step that we're making. And finally, digital modernization, really taking a lot of the stuff that we agreed on in the Trans-Pacific Partnership and bringing that into the NAFTA, providing a rules framework to help our services and our increasingly digitized goods producers move ahead. You know what would make all of these a lot better, all of these areas of competitiveness? If we heard from the European Union on them. Because who is the leader in you know, the evolution of agriculture standards and barriers? That would be the EU, I would say. The EU and the UK are leading on rules for digital, are really thinking through issues to do with privacy and information sharing. Wouldn't it be better if these conversations took place in a group setting rather than in silos? There's so many areas that we're making good progress on in the NAFTA that would make much more sense if we did it in some sort of a transatlantic conversation. Well, you could say, well, you know, we're all competitors, and if it's absolute gains. If they get ahead, then we lose. But really, where is the sort of relative benefit or loss here? I mean, if you take it from the old, you know, competitive framework of you got to put up walls to keep the bad guys out, then clearly we're on the right track for that. But if you think that trade is about bringing willing buyers closer to willing sellers and removing the barriers between them and letting your competitive industries be more competitive in the world, then we need to have better conversations. So I think what we've got in the NAFTA, just to close off, is I don't think this week, but ask me again next week, that we're necessarily going to lose NAFTA 1994. I think we're going to make some really good headway in negotiating text on a NAFTA 2.0, which I think will be kept on a shelf for an indeterminate length of time while we work through the political storms, primarily here in the United States, but also other places. And I think that's a real shame because it's not your NAFTA trading partners that suffer, or you know, it's not the national gains that are as important as the gains from that China is experiencing in the meantime, and other traders who are pursuing a convergence agenda with confidence in their ability to compete in the world. Ta-da.
Thank you, Laura. Thanks to everybody. Clearly there was a lot put out here, but there's a lot more still to explore. For example, at the end, Laura was talking about transatlantic conversations on some of these important issues. I've for a while been in favor of something I like to call the North Atlantic marketplace, where actually all the participants in that market get together and talk about, identify issues where you can explore taking things further. And especially if we have TTIP and cybernetic freeze, deep freeze, whatever it is. There's still a lot going on, and there's a lot crisscrossing, as was quite clear, the implications between the Mexican negotiation and NAFTA and the existing Canadian agreement, NAFTA. And as we made clear at the very beginning, a lot still happening in the US-EU real marketplace. So there's a lot that could be talked about and taken forward if we can find a framework for doing that. But let me open it up here for all of you to explore the issues that you'd like to see explored further. The back corner there. Maybe identify yourself,
I'm
please.
Farzan Illich. So I just want to break it to you. This stuff is really not sexy. In fact, it's really boring. And your average citizen doesn't give a damn about it. But then you may want to say that I don't give a damn about the average citizen, I just want to make money. But at the end of the day, you may have to, because Trumpism may be just the beginning of something. So I would like to use the words of Dubček. He said, I want socialism with a human face. And then I asked him about America, the United States. He said, well, United States is definitely not capitalism with a human face. So maybe what we need now is integration with a human face. So let's bring some other people to the table, not keep it between ourselves, the adults, you mean, and have a more democratic kind of integration.
Okay, well, fortunately, we invited anybody who wanted to come to this meeting. But Sean, why don't you also
I just have to fundamentally take issue with your characterization of trade as unsexy. I just it is in my professional interest to think that this is the sexiest damn thing we can talk about. And I think but I think we're also, so I started off by talking about history, and I think and we've got this kind of the wave theory of and the whale sex theory of trade, but I think we are, we go through periods of kind of backlash and pushes for globalization. We've seen that, I argue that globalization isn't something that started in the 1990s. It's something that started 2,000 plus years ago. Economies have been integrating since, we had, since the Homo sapiens arrived on this earth. The point, I think we're at a really interesting point where if you look at the polls, all of a sudden people, and I mean not the experts, not the trade negotiators, not the policymakers, but the everyday people are taking an interest in trade that they weren't before this conversation. In 2016, whether it was in the UK with Brexit or with Donald Trump here in the US, they were able to crystallize some concerns that people had about the way the global economy was going, the way the US economy was going, the impact of globalization, and so on. And there was a hard conversation that was had. There was there was a big dramatic moment both in the UK and in the US. And then I like to think that on January 1st, 2017, people started to wake up and they kind of went, yeah, but kind of, I like my iPhone. And I like these things that I get through globalization. There's a wonderful Dave Chappelle special where he talks about China jobs. He said, don't talk to me about bringing China jobs back. I don't want a $9,000 iPhone. I don't want to make Nikes. I want to wear them. And he does it in more profane language. But it's wonderful to watch. But he's making, and what's amazing about that is that people are cheering in the audience as he says this. People are laughing. People are buying into that argument, and that's not an audience of trade negotiators. They'd laugh a lot more shyly than that audience does. So that's the point. The second point is we're seeing. You look at the polls for NAFTA, and the way the Pew has done some really good work in tracking this in terms of public sentiment for NAFTA. There are more Americans supportive of NAFTA now than there have been at any point in recent decades, which I think is a really interesting moment, given who's in the White House and where the administration is going. And there are people who are finding a way to make trade very sexy. My favorite bit of trade communication And talk about bringing it home and making it personal that happened in the last year was a tweet from Lindsey Graham that came in January, February of last year. There was a moment where, I don't know if you remember, Sean Spicer stood up on Air Force One and said, "We found a way for Mexico to pay for the wall." It's a 20% tax on imports from Mexico. Very quickly, people on the plane, the reporters on the plane, who all of a sudden have all become trade experts, said, hang on a second, that's not a tax on the Mexicans, that's American consumers paying for those goods. And within a couple of hours, Lindsey Graham tweeted out just a wonderful bit. It really should be in the Smithsonian somewhere, I think. And it said, "Anything that raises the price of beer, tequila, or margaritas is a terrible idea. Mucho sad." And and that just kind of very quickly resonated, and it gave that it put this, you know, the sex and sexy and brought it home for a lot of American families. A few weeks later, during the Super Bowl, you had a huge advertising campaign by Avocados for Mexico. All of a sudden, there was a guacamole supply chain crisis, confronting America, and you've had a real popular moment. So I think that it is being brought home for a lot of people, and it's there. But you're absolutely right. We should be communicating it better.
Okay. Question in the back there with the beard. Oh, you both
Hi.
have beards.
My name is Anshu. I'm a reporter with Inside U.S. Trade. Thank you to the panel for being here. I wanted to ask, investment has been a key topic of the discussion here. I think, Damien, you touched on this briefly. That is the investment court regime that the European Union is advocating, and I believe Canada has put forward a proposal in the NAFTA to do something similar using CETA as a model. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit more about the investment court regime the EU is seeking, how they're planning to push this, and any conflict they might foresee with the United States on this.
Okay. Damien, I guess that's for you.
Well, in TTIP, ISDS became, after a few months, a very sensitive issue in Europe. Suddenly, people knew not only the acronym ISDN, which is on every book, but then ISDS, certainly everybody knew about it, but didn't know that all European countries, or most of them, had bilateral investment treaties with ISDS. And the public debate on TTIP was full of paradoxes. One of them was the epicenter of opposition to ISDS was in Germany, and Germany has more than 130 BITs.
And the first country to have one.
Yeah.
And nobody in Germany, nobody asked that Germany should terminate any of the 130 BITs, including a couple with member states of the European Union. Do you understand the logic? I don't. I've asked the question to many.
Me neither.
To many opponents from Germany, opponents to the ISDS. Oh, but that's different. No, it's not. It's the same issue. But so we had to pause to do a public consultation and see how we needed to improve the ISDS system on the obligations, as I said, to make sure we protect the right to regulate. We clearly define what's indirect expropriation. On the other hand, to make sure the dispute settlement mechanism, and it's true that our BITs, the BITs of the member states, were kind of old-fashioned, very opaque procedures. The arbitrators, you could have an appearance of conflict of interest because the same guys were then arguing as lawyers for plaintiffs or defendants in other cases. So you had a number of issues, no transparency of debates and all that. I think we've really improved that. And we've proposed that in TTIP. It was not greeted with great applause by the US side, at least not the US business community, and all that is public. But we were in negotiations, and we'll see if ever we resume negotiations for a comprehensive trade agreement with the United States. We'll see what we do on ISDS. We'll see what, in the meantime, the United States will have done on NAFTA. We'll see what they want to do with us. Maybe in the meantime, they will have renegotiated CORUS, changed the investment protection chapter of CORUS. I don't know. By the way, our agreement with Korea was the first one with a developed country. Canada was the second. So we'll see. We are also in negotiations with Mexico. We've proposed to the member states that after the court opinion of the European Union on the Singapore FTA, which has an investment protection chapter, which says basically everything is EU competence only except a large chunk of the investment protection chapter and related provisions, I would say. We've proposed to split, to have EU-only FTAs and to have mixed agreements which need to be ratified in the national parliaments of all the member states. And actually, the CETA, this part of CETA which has not entered into force, for which we'll need the ratification of all national parliaments of member states, is part of investment protection. So we have a better model in CETA, but it hasn't entered into force.
Thank you. Our other colleague with a beard.
Justin Margolis with the government of Quebec. And just to follow up on that, I was at a recent Heritage Foundation conference, and they said one of the advantages of Chapter 19 is that it avoids American companies having to go to a Mexican national court held in Spanish with civil law. And I guess a similar equivalent could be said for a Quebec civil law tradition system. With Britain leaving the European Union, the EU loses its largest common law partner. What impact could this have on dispute settlement between the United States and Europe without the largest common law partner, and if there is no NAFTA Chapter 19?
Chapter 11.
Chapter 11, sorry. Thank you, Laura.
Who would like to take that on?
I mean, it's a great question. And you can actually broaden the question, and then I kick the ball in the high grass. But it's an important question, because what will be the impact of the UK leaving on EU law and the development of EU law? And I think a number of experts legal scholars have looked at the jurisprudence, the case law, the evolution of the case law of the European Court of Justice, and said actually UK lawyers have exerted quite a lot of influence on the case law of the Court of Justice. And so we'll see when after the UK has left, what will be the impact on this. I think it's way too early to see the impact on how we would think of dispute settlement chapters or systems. I think the GATT and the WTO in particular is a mixed regime, which from our perspective works very well. We should do everything to make sure we reappoint judges or members of the appellate body as soon as possible. It's an essential part of the global trading system. And it works very well with Chinese law, civil law, common law. And so I think dispute settlement mechanisms are essential in modern trade rules.
I think there's three functions in ISDS that we're looking to achieve, and those functions sort of vary in importance depending on who your investment partner is. I mean, one of them is really to maintain investor confidence, that if something goes awry, that the investor has recourse to a legitimate commercial market. And so that is something that Mexico is working very hard on to ensure that no matter what happens with the NAFTA, that its investors still have those continuing protections. And so you have this very bizarre situation where ISDS was developed in part in order to prevent court settlements from taking place in Mexican courts, and now Mexico is the defender of ISDS because they realize how important investor protection, the perception of investor protection and the reality of investor protection really is. So that's one of the elements. The second element, which has come sort of in the new Trump dynamic, which is kind of new, is if you get rid of ISDS, then you can keep your domestic investors from going abroad. And that's a really challenging, let's use that word, approach, and it's very difficult to write effective investor state law around that. And so in terms of, what do you want to do? We want the perception of investor protection, and we want improved investor protections. And somewhere between perhaps the U.S. jurisprudence on investor state dispute settlement and the European investor court approach, there probably is a 21st century investor state dispute model that we could move to. But we're, again, not having those conversations right now because we're in a sort of twilight zone of getting rid of investor rules so we can keep investors at home.
I'd like to have one other question. All right, time for one other question. Shall we go to our third bearded participant.
Thank you. Andrew Flown with the Embassy of Liechtenstein. So as multiple of the panelists talked about having regulatory standards more harmonized and also then strengthening labor side agreements, then I also talked about learning lessons from Europe. And as Europe moved to the single market, the European social funds and cohesion funds were created to help partners who might have been losing out from some of those changes in labor standards or regulatory standards. Yet in the absence of such a central body that could implement something like that within NAFTA, what's something that the NAFTA might learn from the European transition to a single market that could help offset changes in labor or regulatory practices?
So I think that's a really interesting question, given the focus on sort of helping the left behind, or the people that Trump calls the forgotten people of globalization, if you will. I think one of the things that really struck me about the Brexit vote was how, if you looked at the destination of those social cohesion funds in the EU and looked at the areas that voted for Brexit, there was an inverse correlation, right? I mean, it's places, areas like Sunderland in the north were huge recipients of EU structural funds, the social cohesion funds, and they still voted against being in the EU. So I would argue that there's a kind of limited I mean, one of the lessons I think we should have taken away from 2016 is that whether it's trade adjustment assistance here in the U.S. or whether it's the EU's social cohesion funds, they haven't necessarily worked in the way they were intended to kind of offset the impact of trade on certain communities. But I also think that we have, through the ages, or policymakers through the ages, have made a terrible mistake, and that is in thinking of only the impact of trade on communities, rather than the impact of automation or different technologies. There was a famous moment during the 2016 campaign when Donald Trump stood in front of a closed light bulb factory in Pennsylvania and railed against trade. The reason that factory had shut down had nothing to do with trade. It had everything to do with LED light bulbs and the end of the incandescent light bulb.
Yeah, maybe if I could just comment on that and then thank everybody. Indeed, trade got the blame for technology, really, in this last election in the United States. A number of studies have shown that 85% of the jobs that were lost between 2000 and 2010 were actually due to productivity improvements in their industries. Now, that doesn't mean those people shouldn't have been helped, and the search is still out there for what's an effective way to help those people, but it isn't trade adjustment assistance. It's another package of assistance that actually helps address workforce and help them either relocate, retrain, relearn, and helps areas that lose investment to attract new investment. So it's a series of tools to do that. The EU has tried these funds. As Sean pointed out, it didn't work everywhere. Some places it probably did help. But the U.S., the tools that the U.S. tried have not really helped at all. And that's right now what the search is going on in our society, is what's the best way to do that. Anyway, I want to thank the panel for being here. I want to thank all of you for spending this time, even on such a boring issue and dull issue, as our first questioner pointed out. Thanks very much.